Prospector rides the rail in third. Nadal has a final 3/16, and this is the acid test, and he leads by a length and a half. 3 Technique to the outside. Here comes Coach Baugh, a massive long shot running a big race. Between horses goes Accession, who's come from the back of the pack. And look at this. It is Accession and Nadal. Nadal, Accession, Nadal aces the Rebel.
All right, so we're back today on Racing Rundown. A kind of a little bit of a deviation from what we've been doing over the past couple of days. The Hall of Fame videos have been coming out. I've been trying to get more of those out. And we will be talking a little bit of Hall of Fame on here with our guest today. But just kind of a little bit of stuff separate from the Hall of Fame and, looking ahead at races. So, the situation that we're in right now, obviously there's a lot of questions that have been asked about, how certain things are going to happen with the sport, what races are going to be run where, what tracks are going to still be able to run, all that kind of stuff. So I asked Jay if he'd come on, and, we're going to talk a lot about that. We're going to talk a little bit about the talk about what's happening with tracks and, how certain races are going to be run, what's the deal with, a lot of the stuff that's happening in the industry today, as well as we're also going to get a little bit lighthearted and talk about the Hall of Fame a little bit. So not to waste any more time, I'd like to welcome back on the show Jay Privman. Thanks for taking the time to come by today.
My pleasure, Jack.
So obviously, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is not the way that anyone at the beginning of this year anyone would have expected the way that this racing season were to end up happening. But with respect to the tracks that are still running and those that have had to make changes to their racing schedule and alter the dates of certain races, how has that affected the tracks themselves, and then also some of the horsemen that have had to deviate their plans and things like that?
Well, for the tracks that are running, I think, with the exception of having fans or owners on site, it's kind of been business as usual. They've been able to run and stick to the schedules that they'd had. Gulfstream Park finished off their main meeting with the Florida Derby and has continued on racing as they would have. And Oaklawn has kept going as well. The only thing Oaklawn did was they tweaked some of the dates of their stakes races, and now the Arkansas Derby is going to be on their closing day of May the 2nd, where it would have been on April 11th. Under the original schedule, and they made a couple of other minor tweaks. But other than that, they've been able to go along. It's obviously been far more impactful in Southern California or New York or Kentucky, where racing has been suspended and trainers have had to continue to train while not really knowing the exact date of when races would start up again in those jurisdictions. And in some cases, trainers have shipped horses out of town for stakes races that they might have stayed home for, but with no opportunities in those places, it obviously made sense for them to go, for instance, to Arkansas to run in stakes races there instead. So that's kind of an overview of what's gone on in recent weeks.
Now, looking at some of the most notable instances, or actually, just to be a little bit general in the first place, before we talk about some specifics, do you think there could be a potential of having, some horses that, there was a schedule set out for them at the beginning of the year, or if it wasn't a fine set schedule, at least a general idea, is there a possibility that the halt in racing could affect when we see certain horses come back and how they do once they do come back?
Yeah, I think there are a number of horses that would apply to. Obviously, this time of year, the most notable thing that people pay attention to is the Kentucky Derby. And so, I'll give you one example or a couple of examples there. Maxfield, who was one of the best 2-year-olds in the country last year and won the Breeders' Futurity, he was going to run out of time to make the Kentucky Derby on May the 2nd, but now with the race being postponed, they kind of backed off on his training in March because they didn't have to try and rush him to make a race. They could take a longer-term view, and he'll be ready to run when racing gets going again. He's currently at Keeneland, and I'm sure you'll see him at Churchill Downs. But, he's an example of that, or even a horse in California like Authentic, who was ready to run in the Santa Anita Derby on its original date of April the 4th, but when that race got postponed and racing was suspended at Santa Anita, they decided to back off on him, and you won't see him again probably till June, because there was no reason to have him ready for a Santa Anita Derby that wasn't going to happen then, for a Kentucky Derby that wasn't going to happen on May the 2nd. So that's a couple of examples of horses whose campaigns have been altered by what's going on, but you could apply that, I'm sure, to any number of divisions and horses.
Now, obviously, the decision has already come out that at least confirmed Churchill Downs obviously has set a date now. It's still up in the air when the Preakness is going to happen, but, what kind of impact is that going to have, not having the Kentucky Derby and the Triple Crown in the designated time that it always traditionally has been?
I think everything this year is going to be subject to a chaotic situation, and you're going to have to just sort of play it as it comes. So it's uncharted waters for the Derby. We're used to having it on the first Saturday in May, and the Preakness following by a couple weeks after, and that's just not going to happen this year. And what that'll mean in terms of those races, I think anybody who says they know for sure is full of themselves. It's just a guess as to what it'll all mean, but that's just the reality of the situation. Everybody's having to play with an unprecedented set of parameters owing to the coronavirus situation, and it's impacted races now. It's going to impact the Triple Crown races, and we don't know for sure how much it may impact racing this summer or fall yet. There's just too many unknowns at the moment.
I talked about some of the tracks that are able to run. I do want to talk a little bit about the Arkansas Derby and the situation that's going to be happening there next weekend. But some of the other smaller level tracks that normally don't get the attention that some of them are getting now. Specifically, one I'm thinking of is Fauner Park over out in Nebraska. How much of a benefit, I don't want to say benefit, but is the more traffic, how much to the benefit of the track, for lack of a better term, benefit to those smaller tracks has this been?
So in the case of Fauner, for instance, obviously they've gotten far more attention and far more interest in their races, because one of the smart things they did was racing on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, which are days that they weren't overlapping with the races that are going on right now at Gulfstream or Oaklawn. So they were basically running on the same day as Will Rogers Downs in Oklahoma, and that was a smart move on both those tracks' parts, to just sort of stand out from the crowd, and there's less of a crowd even to begin with. So in terms of Fauner, to your question, it's obviously, it made them a much higher profile, not only nationally but internationally, because people around the world can bet on them. In terms of their bottom line, I was actually talking to their general manager, Chris Katulak, for a story I did for the Racing Forum a couple of weeks ago. And while it's been very helpful to the horsemen there in terms of keeping the purses going, the track hasn't really made that much money off of it, because they make most of their money on the live gate. And like all the tracks that are operating now, there's no patrons allowed there. And they're a track. It's a small track, but they get a good crowd every weekend. They get 6,000 people there, and so the admission money that they get, food and beverage, things of that nature, are things that help that track's bottom line. And so they're not getting as much. They're not getting any actually from that, and the little that they get from handle certainly pays for some expenses, but it's not like the windfall that it would be otherwise.
So, we mentioned the fact that several high-profile Kentucky Derby prep races have not been able to happen. For as you said, there's not really a cement idea about what's going to happen with the Kentucky Derby following this weekend. And Oaklawn Park specifically recognized that and, announced that they will be extending or not necessarily extending, but running the Arkansas Derby in two divisions should the number of entries allow that. I don't want to necessarily say how likely is that to happen, but with the amount of horses that were nominated and the fact that this is the last, not signature, but the last definite Derby prep before we enter the days of uncertainty, how much to the benefit of horsemen in specific is that?
Well, I did a story on that the other day, and the numbers I came up with were somewhere between 15 and 19 horses that may run. And Oaklawn officials had said that they needed to get to 20 to split the race, and they can run a maximum of 14 in a single gate. So it's not certain that the race will be split. The race is being drawn on Sunday. But it's the only game in town right now, as you're saying. And so there are several trainers who want to run a couple of horses in there, like Bob Baffert, Steve Asmussen, Todd Pletcher, among others. But there are some trainers who just chose, I'm just not going to push my horse. For instance, Honor AP from California, who, like Authentic, was sitting on ready for the Santa Anita Derby. I mean, he, in theory, could have gone to the Arkansas Derby, but they're just going to wait, and they just don't want to push him. So even though there's that opportunity, not everybody is deciding they want to go there, because now with the Kentucky Derby pushed back by 4 months, there are some trainers who are taking more of a wait and see attitude, but there are others who have horses ready to go and they want to go. But I'm not certain they're going to get enough to split the race. They may, but I don't know that it's a slam dunk.
Now, do we know that, I know you mentioned some 15 to 19 now, how would that work out if, let's say, there's 15, 16, 17 horses? How does the entries break down as to who gets in the gate and who is not able to get into the gate?
So per the conditions of the race, if they get more than 14 and they don't split, they can run a maximum of 14. And so if they get more than 14 but not enough to split the race into two divisions, the 14 who would get in would be the ones who have the most purse earnings. That's the way it reads. It doesn't say graded earnings or unrestricted earnings. It just says purse earnings. And that means overall earnings, no matter how you got it, whether it was in a state bred race or not. That's the way the conditions read. So if, let's say hypothetically, Jack, 16 horses were entered, the 14 with the most money would get in and the other two would be out. There are no also eligibles. So it would be 14 and 14 alone. It wouldn't be like there's 14 and then two horses hoping they could somehow scratch in. That's how it would work.
So obviously one of the very high-profile tracks that has been trying over the course of the past couple of days to be able to reach an agreement to be able to get back into running is Santa Anita. What's the current situation look like over there out in California with Santa Anita, and when a possibility of a return to racing, if that is something that does happen, when could that come down?
Well, so as of the time that we're taping this, which is on Thursday, April 23rd, shortly after 2 o'clock California time, Santa Anita is shut down, and they were shut down by the LA County Health Department. Santa Anita, late last week, sent a very detailed proposal back to the health department trying to address some of the concerns that the health department had regarding Santa Anita being able to run. It was a very impressive document, I thought, in terms of trying to cover the wide range of things that need to be dealt with. As of now, they have not heard back from the health department. They're anticipating hearing back from the health department. And Santa Anita today put out a notice saying that if they eventually get the green light from the health department, it would still be another 7 to 10 days after that before they'd be able to race. So, whether that's going to happen later today, which I would doubt, but it could. It could happen tomorrow. It might not happen for 2 more weeks. It's a very fluid situation, but Santa Anita is hopeful of getting up and running, and as soon as they get the green light, it'll take them about a week to 10 days to be able to start conducting racing again.
All right, so that's just kind of a little bit of how the general outlook on the rest of the country is. Obviously, as Jay mentioned, and can be reasonably assumed, this is a very fluid situation. Things are going to change. Things change very quickly during this. So, obviously, once the time is right, I know a lot of people have said this about a lot of different things, but once the time's right, things will resume. But getting to a little bit of a lighter topic, talking about something that's coming up in a couple of weeks is the annual announcement of inductions into the Hall of Fame. And, Jay is on the nominating committee, so pretty appropriate to talk to him about some of the horses that are nominated for the Hall of Fame, and also not just the horses, but some trainers as well as jockey Corey Nakatani as well. So I'll just run through quickly those horses right now if you don't already know. For racehorses, you've got nominees returning from last year: Blind Luck, Aberrated Grace, and Belmont Stakes winner Rags to Riches. New this year, Wise Dan, Game On Dude, as well as champion sprinter from 2000, Kona Gold. So those are the 6 horses that are up for consideration. You've also got trainers Doug O'Neill, Christophe Clement, Mark Cassie, Doug O'Neill, and the aforementioned jockey Corey Nakatani. And I do apologize, I did leave off one guy, trainer David Whiteley. So, kind of the way that I thought about this is a lot of these horses specifically, a lot of them on this list are, they're really talented horses in their own right. Aside from Wise Dan, who I think a lot of people would recognize is really the only sure slam dunk bet. There's a lot of horses on this list that have, something holding them back, whether it's they don't necessarily have the longevity or some kind of an inconsistency or some other thing that has kind of gotten in their way a little bit. How do you see this current crop with respect to the horses looking this year?
I think it's a very good group. One nice thing about the way the Hall of Fame has set things up now is that the voters who vote on the horses or the trainers or the jockey that are on this year's ballot, it's a straight up and down vote. You could, in theory, vote all of them in. It's not like Wise Dan, if he gets in, no other horses get in, or if Doug O'Neill gets in, that's the only trainer. I mean, they all could, in theory, get in. They just need to get as much support as possible. But I think it's a very strong group. I think there's a number of worthy candidates on this year's ballot, and I would beg to differ on your theory or pronouncement that Wise Dan is the only horse that doesn't have any holes in him, because I would be hard-pressed to see what someone could see in Kona Gold that would prevent him from being in the Hall of Fame. He was a world-class sprinter for a number of years. He ran in the Breeders' Cup 5 straight times. He won it one year. He set a track record there and at Santa Anita. He was a multiple graded stakes winner. And, from a Beyer speed figure standpoint, he ran a Beyer figure of 110 or better 17 times, 115 or better 10 times, and had a career best of 123. And he did that while winning 14 times in 30 starts. I think he is a very deserving and would be a very worthwhile addition to the Hall of Fame.
That's a very good point to bring up. We did hit on that. If you're interested on some of the more in-depth looks at some of the horses, we're still a little bit behind on everyone, but we do have our Kona Gold look down at him. So if you want to check that out right there, it did hit on a little bit of some of the points that Jay brings up there. But, with respect to some of the trainers and Corey Nakatani, how do you see the outlook looking with them?
Well, Corey Nakatani had a great career, and I think one of the reasons that maybe he got a little bit overshadowed for part of his career is that he was just competing against what at the time was just a world-class room of riders at Santa Anita in the 90s and aughts. But Corey, his Breeders' Cup record he's one of the top 10 all time in terms of Breeders' Cup wins. He was terrific on both turf and dirt. He won riding titles at every major racetrack in Southern California, and he won just a number of major races throughout his career. So I think he's going to get a ton of support to go into the Hall of Fame.
Now, could you see some of the trainers like someone like David Whiteley, who's been on for a long time? Could you see some of those people getting the push to finally get in this year?
I hope so. I think one of the problems that some of the voters have probably had with him is that he passed away, or he stopped training a long time ago. And he trained during an era when trainers didn't have the large numbers of horses in their care that they do now, where you see guys like Chad Brown or Todd Pletcher or Steve Asmussen that have, multiples of scores of horses into the hundreds. Whiteley always had a small barn, but he always produced, and he won a number of major races, but he was in the pre-Breeders' Cup era, and I just think it's kind of an apples and oranges comparison that people maybe try and make between him and someone who's more contemporary, like Doug O'Neill or Mark Cassey or Christophe Clement, all who were the other trainers on this year's ballot and who were all still very active. But Whiteley was a great trainer, and he's been on the ballot in the past. I've voted for him every time he's been on the ballot. I hope he finally gets in. He should be in. But this, I think, is his last year on the contemporary ballot, and if he doesn't get in, I think he would end up going to the Historic Review Committee, which is basically the Racing Hall of Fame's version of the Old Timers Committee. And I'm certain he'll get in with them. But he should get in on the contemporary ballot, and I hope he does this year.
Now that actually does bring a good segue to one thing that I wanted to ask about. Is there any horse that jumps off the paper to you as one that could be something that the Historic Review Committee looks at and decides to put in like they did with Waya last year?
I don't know who all they're looking at this year, so that's an impossible question for me to answer. I know which horses are on the current contemporary ballot, and like I said, I know that Whiteley is on the ballot I believe the last time on the contemporary ballot, and then he would go into the Historic Review purview. But I don't know specifically, Jack, who the Historic Review Committee would be considering this year among horses, trainers, or jockeys.
All right, so
I'm not on that committee.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know you were going to jump right back in with something. Sorry about that. All right, so that is it for this segment. Again, once again, I'd like to thank Jay for taking the time to come back on the show. We, like I said at the beginning of this, that fluidity is the word that everyone's been using, and it's going to take time to figure out how everything's going to work out. But once that is, we'll hear about it, and then decisions will start to be made on when certain things are going to happen, when we'll see horses come back, and when things will happen. So once again, Jay, thanks for stopping by the program today.
Oh, my pleasure, Jack. Thanks for having me on again.
And these two have sprinted 3 lengths clear of Long Range Toddy. Then comes Laughing Fox, Omaha Beach. Improbable in second. Omaha Beach is now a length in front. Improbable gonna try him one more time. Omaha Beach. Improbable to the outside. Omaha Beach just won't let him by yet. Improbable second. Omaha Beach. Yes!